Good morning. Today I want for us to consider the will of God. And that's a big topic, and it's a phrase we throw around a lot. Well, that just must have been God's will, and I hope it'll be God's will that X, Y, or Z happens and that kind of thing. And oftentimes I think we shortchange God. We see God's will as kind of like a set of train tracks, and this train is on the tracks, and no matter what happens, the train just stays on those tracks, and whether good or ill happens to us, it just had to be the will of God because we're on this train. But in fact, the will of God is much more complex, but also much, much more beautiful than a set of train tracks. To me, it is more like a decision tree where no matter what happens, and some things are within the will of God and some things are outside of the will of God, we know that from Scripture. So no matter what happens, God, though, can take those decisions that we make. Well, if Courtney does this, which is outside of my will, I can still bring him back in here. If this, then that. If this happens to her, I can still help and bring her back to where she needs to be. I can take the evil that is done and I can turn it into good. If then, and it is an endless supply of alternatives. The Star Trek universe gives us this as a maxim. Let me share with you a really quick clip with Spock and Scotty.
Consider the alternatives, Mr. Scott.
We have no fuel. What alternatives?
Mr. Scott, there are always alternatives.
Now, in that fictional universe, there are always alternatives, but in God's world, also because of God, there are always alternatives. And that brings us finally to our story for today. It is the story of Joseph towards the end of Genesis, the 45th chapter. Joseph has already been sold into slavery by his brothers. He has been a slave in Egypt. He has been wrongly accused of what we would call today sexual harassment and thrown in prison. And now, because he is a dreamer, he has risen to the second in command in Egypt, saving all of Egypt and the surrounding countries from the famine, and he finally reveals himself to his brothers who have come to Egypt seeking relief. Genesis 45, 1 through 5. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him. When Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life." Later in the 50th chapter, when their father dies, the brothers are afraid that maybe Joseph has been waiting for this all along and now he's going to take revenge on them. And Joseph says what he said in Genesis 45 in an even more powerful way. He says, "What you intended for evil, God turned and used for good." And that is this wonderful sense of even when other people do things to us that are for evil, God can turn that to good. Even when evil, bad things happen to us, simply because we live in a fallen world. If I get some disease or I have an accident or whatever, it isn't that it was God's will that happened necessarily, but rather God can take that evil because I'm living in this evil world and turn it for good in one way or another. When I make bad and evil decisions, God can also use those and turn those in one way or another. And so I think this, at least as a minimum, calls us to do a couple of things, the scripture passage from today. First, we need to recognize and look in our lives, how is it that God is working even in the midst of other things that perhaps aren't part of God's will? How is God able to use those? What alternatives are God using to turn that, to use what others may want to use for evil for good, to use what we even may want to use for evil and turn us back towards the good? Let us examine our lives and see what God is doing right now, right today. And one of the ways that we're going to have to examine our lives is to notice that Joseph does an amazing thing in this passage. He forgives his brothers. He doesn't say, "Oh, it doesn't matter." He says, "You sold me into Egypt. You did this to me, And yet I don't want you to be distressed. I don't want you to be angry with yourselves, because what you did for evil, God turned to good. You were trying to take life, and God used it to preserve life. That is truly divine. That shows how close Joseph was to God. We say to err is human, to forgive is divine. It truly takes the wonderful forgiveness that God offers to us, for us then to be able to offer it to others. But if we're going to be able to take what has happened to us and let God use it for good, we're going to have to find ways to forgive. Not to forget, not to say it doesn't matter, it didn't matter, it does matter, but to say rather, even though you meant this for evil, God turned it for good, and for your good even. Can you bless those who have wronged you? That's some heady stuff, it's some hearty stuff, but it also is beautiful gospel stuff. And so on this day, spend some time contemplating the wonderful decision tree that God has grown in your life, and also contemplate what decisions does God want you to make today. We can do this because no matter what, we know God is with us.